In a small, forgotten town surrounded by dense, ever-creaking woods, there was an old house that everyone avoided. The locals called it the Dread House, a place where shadows seemed to cling to every corner, and whispers floated on the wind even on the stillest of nights. No one had lived there for years, but the stories remained. There were tales of people going in and never coming out, of strange lights flickering in the windows at night, and of screams, endless, blood-curdling screams that echoed through the trees long after dusk fell. But what terrified people the most was not the house itself. It was the figure that was sometimes seen standing by the window on the second floor. Pale, unmoving, and watching. Always watching. One chilly autumn evening, a group of friends, Claire, Ryan, James, and Sophie, decided to challenge the stories. They were young and bold, laughing at the legends that had scared the townsfolk for generations. They had heard about the house for as long as they could remember, but none of them believed it could be as bad as the tales claimed. "It's just an old, empty building," Ryan had said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "We'll go in, take some pictures, and leave. Maybe we'll even make some money off the photos. People love this haunted house stuff." The others agreed. They all wanted a thrill, something to break the monotony of their small-town lives. So, they made a plan. They would go at night, of course, when the atmosphere would be at its eeriest. Ryan brought a flashlight, Claire carried her camera, James had a small pocket knife dash just in case, he said with a wink, and Sophie, the most reluctant of the group, brought a thick wool blanket. "If it gets cold," she had mumbled, though she secretly hoped it would comfort her when her nerves inevitably got the best of her. They reached the house just as the sun began to sink below the horizon. The trees surrounding the property loomed like dark sentinels, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes against the dimming sky. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the ground seemed to absorb their footsteps, muffling their movements as they approached the front gate. The house stood before them, tall and crooked, its windows black and empty like soulless eyes staring down at them. The roof sagged in places, and the wooden boards that made up the exterior were weathered and warped with age. Yet, despite its dilapidated appearance, there was something menacing about it. Something that made Sophie want to turn around and run back to the safety of her home. Ryan was the first to push open the creaking gate, his bravado masking the slight tremor in his hands. "Come on," he urged, looking back at the others. "Let's get this over with." The front door was unlocked, as they expected. No one had lived here for decades, so why would it be? They stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under their weight. The smell of rot and mildew hit them immediately, thick and pungent, causing them to wrinkle their noses in disgust. The air inside the house was colder than it had been outside, and a strange draft seemed to swirl around their ankles, even though no windows were open. "Let's split up," Ryan suggested, his voice echoing slightly in the empty hall. "We'll cover more ground that way. Claire and I will take the second floor. James, Sophie, you check out the first." Sophie didn't like the idea of splitting up, but she didn't want to seem scared in front of the others. Reluctantly, she nodded, gripping her blanket tightly as she followed James down the dark, narrow hallway. The house was eerily quiet, the only sounds the soft creaking of the floorboards beneath their feet and the occasional drip of water from somewhere unseen. As they moved deeper into the house, a sense of unease settled over them. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows grew thicker, darker, almost as if they were alive. James tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes and making sarcastic comments about the house's condition, but Sophie wasn't listening. She felt like they were being watched. She kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced she would see someone or something lurking in the darkness behind them. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence. Upstairs, Ryan and Claire explored the second floor. The floor was in worse shape than the one below, with large gaps between the boards and sections that felt like they might give way at any moment. They moved carefully, trying to avoid the more treacherous spots. "This place is a death trap," Claire muttered as she snapped a few pictures of the decaying walls. "I can't believe people actually lived here once." Ryan didn't respond. He was staring down the hallway, his brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" he asked quietly. "Hear what?" "Footsteps. I swear I heard footsteps." Claire shook her head. "Probably just the house settling. This place is falling apart." But Ryan wasn't convinced. The sound had been distinct, soft, but deliberate, like someone was walking just out of sight. He shone his flashlight down the hallway, illuminating the peeling wallpaper and the broken doors that led into the other rooms. Nothing moved. There was no one there. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted. Ryan couldn't shake it. He pressed on, Claire following close behind, her camera flashing occasionally as she documented the decaying interior. But with each step, the unease grew, as if the house itself was pushing back, unwilling to let them delve deeper into its secrets. Downstairs, James and Sophie had made their way into the kitchen. The air was thick with the smell of mold and something foul that neither of them could place. The cabinets were mostly empty, their doors hanging askew, but there were a few rusted cans of food on the shelves, their labels faded and unreadable. The sink was filled with murky water that looked like it had been sitting there for years, the surface slick with an oily sheen. "Gross," James muttered, wrinkling his nose. "I bet this place has rats." Sophie didn't respond. She was staring at something in the corner of the room. A shadow. It wasn't moving, but there was something off about it, something that made her skin crawl. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you see that?" James turned to look, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion. "See what?" "The shadow. Over there, by the pantry." James squinted, but he didn't see anything unusual. "Sophie, it's just a shadow. The light's playing tricks on you." But Sophie wasn't so sure. The shadow seemed darker than the others, more solid. And it wasn't shaped like the pantry or anything else in the room. It was shaped like a person. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from upstairs, followed by a Claire's scream. James and Sophie bolted out of the kitchen and ran for the stairs, their hearts racing. They took the steps 2 at a time, their fear growing with each passing second. When they reached the second floor, they found Ryan and Claire standing in the hallway, their faces pale and their eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" James demanded, his voice shaking. Claire pointed down the hallway toward one of the open doors. We found something," she stammered. "Something horrible." Ryan nodded, his expression grim. "You need to see this." They led James and Sophie into the room at the end of the hall. It had once been a bedroom, but now it was nothing more than a decaying shell. The walls were stained with dark streaks that looked disturbingly like dried blood, and the floor was littered with debris. But it wasn't the state of the room that had terrified Claire. It was little more than a skeleton, the bones yellowed with age and tangled in what looked like old, torn clothing. But there was something wrong with it, something unnatural. The bones were twisted, contorted into impossible shapes, as if the person had been bent and broken in ways that defied explanation. Sophie felt bile rise in her throat as she stared at the gruesome sight. How did this happen?" Ryan shook his head, his face ashen. "I don't know. But this isn't the worst part." He pointed to the wall above the skeleton, where something had been scrawled in what looked like blood. The words were smeared and faded, but they were still legible. They watch. They wait. They hunger. A chill ran down Sophie's spine. "Who wrote that?" "I don't think it matters," Ryan said quietly. "What matters is that whoever or whatever did this might still be here." As if on cue, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and a soft whisper filled the air. It was unintelligible at first, just a low murmur, but then the words became clearer. Get out! Get out! Get out! The four friends stood frozen, their eyes wide with fear. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it was almost a scream. Get out! Without thinking, they bolted from the room, their fear propelling them down the hallway and toward the stairs. But as they reached the top of the staircase, they stopped dead in their tracks. The front door, which had been wide open when they entered, was now shut tight. And standing in front of it was the figure they had only heard about in the stories, a pale, ghostly figure with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the figure raised its hand and pointed at them. "You should have stayed away," it whispered, its voice raspy and cold. "Now, you belong to the house." The lights flickered, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like living things. The friends tried to run, but the shadows blocked their path, closing in on them from all sides. The house groaned and creaked as if it were waking from a long slumber, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay and death. "We have to get out of here," James shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers and creaks. But there was nowhere to go. The shadows pressed closer, their cold tendrils wrapping around their limbs, pulling them deeper into the house. The figure by the door watched with an eerie calmness, its smile growing wider and more grotesque with each passing second. Sophie struggled against the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, sapping her strength. "Help me," she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The shadows vanished, the whispers stopped, and the house was still once more. But the four friends were gone. The town would go on to tell the story of the four teenagers who disappeared inside the Dread House, just like all those who had come before them. People would whisper about the lights that still flickered in the windows at night and the figure that sometimes appeared at the window, watching, waiting. But no one would ever enter the house again. Because everyone knew that once you entered the Dread House, you never came out. And the house? It waited. It always waited for the next curious soul to venture too close, for the next group of foolish adventurers who thought they could escape its grasp. It was patient, and it was hungry. It always had been.